Good evening. Am I audible?
Ma'am. Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
Well, so today we just have one student in the class. Just hold on a minute till I share the PPT with you. Oh, no. I'm so sorry. Wait, wait. So, last class we were talking about the relationship between common sense and sociology. Please hold on a minute. Yeah. So, yesterday we were discussing about the relationship between common sense and sociological knowledge, and if you remember, I had put forth a question before you that how your analysis of your everyday life is different from a common lay person's analysis. I guess everybody can understand Odia. the way you look at your everyday life, the way you analyze your surrounding, प्रत्येक मनीष तार निज लाइफ रो गोटे विश्लेषण करे गोटे घटनाटी घटी गले कि मोर लाइफ रे कौन चली आई हैव सर्टन सेंस ऑफ एनालिसिस तेनु से सोशियोलॉजी पाठ पढ़ी थाउ किंबा पढ़ी न थाउ they will have something to speak about. So how it is different from the analysis of that of a sociologist? What do you have to say? Any one of you? आम बारंबार कहे सोशियोलॉजी रे केबे रॉन्ग आंसर बोली किछि न थाए then please speak up. No? You not even give a try? Okay. So basically, when we are referring to a lay person or a common man on the street who tries to take up an analysis of what is happening in his or her life or what is happening around him or her, that roots from one's commonsensical knowledge. And when you say something, it is based on a sociological knowledge that is based on certain scientific, systematic understanding of the world. And if you see, common sense appears to be much closer to sociological knowledge in some sense or the other. And that's the reason people take this discipline for granted. People think that, it's the most easiest discipline. You don't have to study anything in it. ପିଲାମାନେ ୟୁପିଏସସି ଓପିଏସସି ରେ ସବଜେକ୍ଟଟା ସମସ୍ତେ ନେଇ ଯାଆନ୍ତି ସେମାନଙ୍କୁ ଲାଗେ ଯେ ଏଟା ପଢିବାକୁ ପଡିବନି ବିକଜ ଇଟ୍ ଇଜ କମନ ସେନ୍ସିକାଲ ମୁଁ ଆଖପାଖରେ ଯାହା ଦେଖୁଛି whatever I see around myself, I will be able to write it without referring to any text. But there lies the problem. As I told you, common sense is something whose source you are not sure of. It has been passed on to you by your forefathers. Maybe I have been hearing these tales of something about certain things from my grandmother. As a child, it has, made a place in my mind. And I tend to believe that. But when you talk about the scientific nature of common sense, it has not been proved. We do not know the origin of common sense. तार source कौन आमको जଣା नहीं केबेठु आरंभ होइछि आमको जଣା नहीं, but it has been handed down to us. And since it's been a tradition, and as we respect tradition, we tend to accept it as something which is true, something which is practical. So there you have a kind of a, what you say, you tend to legitimize that form of knowledge. And we believe that common sense being so close to our lives, we tend to believe it. So here I don't deny that you should disbelieve common sense, but as a social scientist, you have to take it with a pinch of salt. Social science, as a discipline, it forms a part of everybody's experience. ମୁଁ ଯେମିତି କହିଲି କି if you talk about nuclear physics or you talk about microbiology, that pertains to be a very specialized field that not many people would be taking interest in. But the sociologist's job is that of, your everyday lives one is dealing with. So everybody has the right to make comments on their own lives or what is happening around them. Because they are all members of the same society that you are of. So that's the reason it seems so that sociological knowledge is close to common sense. It has, a but the basic difference is that sociology as a body of knowledge has certain concepts. It uses certain data that is verified. We have a systematic method of verifying that data and then making it a piece of knowledge, whereas common sense is something which has never been tasted. The moment you say that okay, something is commonsensical, that's the end of the argument. You don't have to prove anything. That is self explanatory. People will not ask you further question. They will see that okay, it's common sense, okay, taken for granted. Maybe I'll not you know have any doubt in my mind about it. So scientific knowledge in general is not universal, while commonsensical knowledge is somehow particularized and localized, because the idea of common sense is it will vary from society to society, from time to time. ହୁଏତ 10 ବର୍ଷ ପୂର୍ବରୁ କି 50 ବର୍ଷ ପୂର୍ବରୁ ଯୋଉଟାକୁ ଆମେ ଠିକ ବୋଲି ଭାବୁଥିଲେ based on common sense, today you will not feel the same about the same thing. You will feel times have changed, because the idea of common sense is also undergoing change. So basically, common sense is particularistic and localized, but when you are talking about a scientific piece of knowledge, it is universal, it is valid everywhere, it is applicable to the larger society in general. The common perception is that in social science, we have a series of concepts. In case of Indian sociology, you have concepts like village, caste, neighborhood, you know, maybe when I said that sociology is, people tend to think that sociology is a discipline where you don't have to read it, because for example something like village, okay, I have certain experience of my own village. So if there is some question on village, I can write about my experience. I have certain knowledge on caste system in India. I don't have to, without reading I can write. But what you will be writing, it is very very localized kind of a knowledge that that prevails perhaps in your locality, that prevails only in your community. It cannot be a generalized piece of knowledge. So that's the reason why we all feel that there is some kind of interrelationship between sociology and common sense, but sociological knowledge needs to replace common sense. So basically one of the major purposes of this discipline would be to study common sense, because common sense has a sense of legitimacy associated with it. I'll try to take this discussion further, because it is very, whenever you take up any research in sociology, this is the first question you are encountered with: how to differentiate between commonsensical knowledge and sociological knowledge, because that is how you can stand out in terms of your arguments, in terms of your analysis, by keeping yourself in a distance from commonsensical knowledge. So you will see that these commonsensical beliefs would challenge your scientific examination. Ideas on religion, nationalism, caste, and to name a few, may not tolerate scientific examination. Common sense is social, and sociology studies common sense. Just try to think about this particular statement. Common sense is social. It emerges from the social context. It is very, very contextualized, it is very, very localized, and at the same time, it is your responsibility as a sociologist to study common sense and understand that, how come this particular idea could gain so much of popularity, that it has been, you know, uh, disseminating from one generation to another. So basically, common sense has a particular trait of maintaining status quo, because It is something that deals with maintaining the kind of existing social order or the existing regime to stand the way it is. So it reinforces the status quo so that you do not welcome any kind of change. So there are certain proverbs that I have noted here, like a stitch in time saves nine, time is money, there is a woman behind every conflict. We have heard it, isn't it? These are all commonsensical knowledge. For example, the last one, that there is a woman behind every conflict. I have heard my grandparents talk about it. They talk about it with reference to Mahabharata and Ramayana. That be it Mahabharata, be it Ramayana, be it any household story, there is always a woman behind any kind of conflict. How do you react to this? Is it true? Tell me yes or no. Absolutely no response. Okay. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say that it could be true, yet it could be false. It has not been proved yet. So when you tend to draw certain conclusions or inferences from certain commonsensical statements, you might be in a risk, at a position of risk, because you are not in a position to prove something or disprove something. So it is not common and it will not make sense in all types of societies. For example, when you say that there is a woman behind every conflict, it might not be true for every kind of society. Time is money, a stitch in time saves nine. It could be true for most of the society. But a society which guards its mental health, which doesn't believe in hurrying around, it believes in taking its own time, maintaining its own peace and tranquility, it might not be true for that kind of a society. So mostly you will see the idea of inequality is always maintained in the garb of common sense. Whenever we tend to hide something, or we tend to justify something, we try to hide it behind certain commonsensical statements. So mostly when it comes to certain kind of inequalities, be it on the grounds of caste, class, or gender, you will see that certain commonsensical statements would emerge in this context. So these are dominant ideas associated with common sense. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that who provides these commonsensical statements? So mostly you will see that a particular commonsensical statement would have its source from the dominant regime of that society or the dominant categories of the society. So that it is something in a Marxian sense, it would be a part of the ruling class. The ruling ideas mostly comes from the ruling class. So common sense would try to justify those positions of inequality. So that's the reason why sociology as a discipline, which seems to be so similar to common sense, needs to challenge common sense at every point of time. That's a methodological issue we take up. Firstly, how do you distinguish yourself from commonsensical knowledge? How a piece of sociological knowledge is different from commonsensical knowledge? And secondly, how you challenge that common sense. You need to verify that piece of common sense, that whether it holds to be true or not. That is one aspect of it. Then coming to another concept which is very important for you when you take up any course in research methodology, it is especially important for a social scientist. That is the idea of reflexivity. I'll give you an example. I'll try to give you an example. Uh, See, when I say that a microbiologist tries to see something under the microscope, what it sees is a part of its object of inquiry. Okay, it is a subject that it is trying to understand, but in case of a sociologist, when you are using your own tools to study something like that of a microbiologist, what do? Normally, you would see that you are also a part of that field that you are observing. Yes or no? Because when a microbiologist is looking into the microscope, it sees germs and it sees all kinds of, micro uh, microbes that isn't visible to your naked eyes. But the problem with a sociologist is that when a sociologist is trying to understand one aspect of the society, the sociologist himself or herself would be part of that field that he or she is trying to study under the microscope. So there is an innate nature of bias, which is a greatest methodological challenge on our part. So it could be said that it is much easier to take up any research in natural sciences than in social sciences. The reason being that you are also a part of the field that you are trying to study. You cannot it's very difficult to keep yourself away from it, because your presence would be there. And when I say your presence would be there, it means that your inclinations, your biases, your prejudice would be a part of it. So the idea of reflexivity, or sometimes we call it self reflexivity, is something which Goldner believes that it is opposed to the idea of positivism, because positivism has given you the goals that you have to you know stand out as an observer, who is not a part of the field. So just you are being just a distant observer who is trying to understand that field that you are looking at. But here, when that's one of the basic differences between an anthropologist and a sociologist is that an anthropologist has always studied an alien society traditionally. Now these boundaries have blurred. Traditionally they have studied alien societies. You will mostly find these white men studying these primitive tribes in some distant isolated island, whereas a sociologist mostly studies his or her own society. So that's the reason why Goldner believes that knowledge is never independent of the knower. You have to be a part of the field where you exist. So the presence of the researcher almost alters the reality. Positivism would say that you're doing it as an observer. So it really doesn't matter it's you or it's me. Somebody needs to go there and observe in minute detail, trying to maintain the protocol, trying to have the systematic approach towards that kind of a study, and you will get the results. But what happens in this qualitative studies, mostly the constructivist approach that we were discussing yesterday, you will see that the presence of the researcher itself would alter the reality. If you go to the field and instead of you, I go to the field, I will come up with a different kind of result that you might not be able to see. So here you will see that the objectivity is saved by the way the researcher sees the problem. You cannot have a universal kind of an objectivity that you know natural scientists they deal with, because the kind of objectivity that they have been talking about, it is something which is you know which is very very universal. And at the same time, when I say again and again, they deal with inanimate objects, and you are mostly dealing with human beings, human societies. You are a and a member of that same human society that you are going to study. So there you have to, your idea of objectivity will take a different shape. It needs to be reshaped, reconstituted in a different way. I'll be talking about objectivity in this class in few minutes. So mostly you will see that some facts are gathered in the process of our lives and not through research process. There is nothing problematic about it. Of a positivist would say that, okay, you went for your field work, what is it that you found? Now, I was in the field for the last 1 year and these are the things. So, okay, approved. This is a very systematic piece of research because methodologically you have been so very accurate. But when I'm talking about this constructivist approach, I would say that, I'm trying to study my own society, and I grew up in this kind of an atmosphere. This is something which I have registered as a part of my growing up. And it's not that I am just carrying out my participant observation process just for 1 year, or I'm in the field for the last 6 months or 1 or 2 years. I have devoted, say, if I am a 30 or 35-year-old person, you know this is how I grew up, and for the last 30-35 years I have witnessed this. Can it not pass off as a piece of data? So that's what they say, that in the very process of our lives, and not through the just the through the research process. So when you gather these kind of data, there shouldn't be anything problematic about it. So, how the facts are ordered and meaning is elicited, it is important. So, reflexive sociology ends the distinction between the layperson who are studied and the sociologist who studies them. So, as I was telling you in the previous class, that when we are talking about a positivist approach, you tend to maintain a hierarchy between the person who is out there to study and the person who is being studied. So, reflexive sociology at least says that no, no, no. You have to be one with the person that is out there in the field. So when you are doing a participant observation, or when you are into this ethnographic eh, into this process of doing ethnography, you be one with the participants, with your respondents. So basically, you know you tend to set off all differences that you have with your objects of inquiry. So, absence of reflexivity would keep the distinction. So, basically, in positivist approach, there is this absence of reflexivity, and since positivism is something which has been inspired from natural sciences, they don't need to be reflexive the way you need to be as a social scientist. So you cannot know others unless you know yourself. Reflexivity changes the very idea and the very meaning of knowledge. It is no more a piece of information, but it becomes awareness. So you are not out there to collect information, just raw information. you go out there where you are trying to understand their ways of looking at the world. So that becomes a piece of awareness rather than a piece of information. It establishes a relationship between being a social scientist and being a human being, a person, between the role and the person you are performing. So basically, that gap of being a researcher and being a member of the community or part of the society, that is being bridged up with your idea of reflexivity. So the first thing that we need to understand here is that reflexivity is opposed to methodological dualism, the separation between the subject and the object of research. We don't believe in this hierarchy. We don't believe that there needs to be a separation between the object of research and the subject of research. So it believes that if a social scientist engages politically, socially, or emotionally with the objects of study, scientific nature of the discipline will not be lost. That's what this reflexivity says. But had it been a positivist, they would have said that you have disturbed the entire equilibrium. You are being biased. How come you are showing your inclination towards certain kind of a political ideology, or maybe you are being biased because you belong to the same kind of society. It is very very definite. Suppose I would say that as a woman, I have witnessed my mother being abused in the form of domestic violence. So I will have that kind of a sensitivity. I would pick up that kind of a research area, and I would try to understand those nuances because I have been a witness to this phenomena for the last, say, 20-25 years. So it's not just that, I'm trying to gather these pieces of information in the last 6 months or 1 year. I have been a part of it. So what's wrong in it? That's how the idea of reflexivity would challenge the positivist position of doing research. So, according to Goldner, it may amount to alienation on the part of the researcher. Reflexivity is to understand the researcher's own influence. Basically, they tend to believe that if you have an inclination for a particular say subject or a particular thing, maybe certain kind of bias will creep in while you are conducting a study. So the basic idea here is that reflexivity is an attempt to understand that if I have myself some kind of, in some way or the other, I am trying to influence my own study. So Bourdieu would say that researcher must step into the other person's shoe to understand why things happen in that way. You have to, because as I told you yesterday, it is not your duty, not just your duty, to understand the falsity or the truthfulness of a certain event or a thing. We, as sociologists, we may not need it, but what is important for us, it is very important for us to understand if something is really you know relevant for a community as far as its perception is concerned, how a particular community or how a particular group tends to construct their idea of social reality. For them, what is that reality? What is their understanding of that thing? That understanding could be vague for me, but it is my sole prerogative to understand their understanding rather than to look for the truthfulness or facticity of certain things. So, in that way, a sociologist or a social scientist would vary from other natural scientists. So, reflexivity is skeptical about our ways and examine what we do, how we feel. So, social scientists are themselves objects of study who are a part of the social reality under scanner. You are out there to study something, but as I told you, You are a part of what you see under the microscope. That doesn't happen with a microbiologist or a physicist. When somebody is trying to see something under the microscope, they see something which is outside them, but you become a part of that field of observation. That is the basic challenge that a sociologist faces. Then there is another important component that we have to take into consideration whenever we talk about sociological research. That is the idea of objectivity. I guess you have come across this term. Since it's a master's program, I believe those who have completed their graduations in not only just in social science, in any social science, not only in just sociology, you'd have dealt with this concept of objectivity. It should not be new to you. So basically, what it is, objectivity is the research principle that requires that all personal values and views of the investigator must be kept out of the research process. The reason is to minimalize the personal prejudices, biases, so that your idea of understanding social reality is not affected by the investigator's own interpretation. You tend to talk about universal laws from a positivist perspective. You tend to think of, you know, uh, having a neutral standpoint where you are not affecting the study. So that's how we think, how objectivity has to be maintained. I'll give you an example. uh, there was this study that was conducted i- by in this GE, one of the plants of GE. And I guess, have you heard of Hawthorne? There is this concept called Hawthorne effect. Are you aware of it? No? Well, Hawthorne was a social scientist, and he wanted to study one of these, the very idea of labor relations, the how, he was trying to study productivity in these manufacturing industries. And he maintained all kinds of research protocol, and he went to one of these plants. And the laborers, the workers of those plants were informed that there is a person who would be there, who would be in this plant, and he would be there for few days, and he would be trying to study you. And it was seen that during the phase of its study, the production process actually, and it became it enhanced by enhanced three times or four times, just because the workers were given the impression that somebody is out there to study them, and they had this feeling of impressing that person. So that is called the Hawthorne effect. How the researchers presence actually affected the productivity and affected the study as such, because the kind of enhancement in that productivity process that we are talking about, it was for a minimal phase. And things got back to normalcy after Hawthorne made himself absent from that place. That was called the Hawthorne effect. So the reason why I'm telling you this here is that how you know it is relevant for the researchers to make their presence influence a particular study. So mostly in a positivist perspective, they would not welcome this kind of a phenomena. And that's the reason they say that the idea of the known and the knower has to be separated. It has to be differentiated and maintained. So, when you talk about objectivity in science and especially in social science, you might have heard of it that objectivity is always considered to be the opposite of subjectivity. So you have these pairings, like, when you talk about objectivity, it's like it is opposite to partiality, relativity, arbitrarily. So it is an opposition to subjectivity. And what is subjectivity? Subjectivity is associated, always associated with the concept of the self. That means when your self is intervening into this process of research, we say that your study has been subjective. I do doubt the objectivity of the study. So that's how we have been talking about this particular term. So the first thing I want you to understand is that objectivity stands in contrast to subjectivity. An objective account is one which attempts to capture the nature of the object studied in a way that doesn't depend on any features of the particular subject who studies it. So basically, in case of Hawthorne, we would say that objectivity was affected because the very presence of the researcher affected the very subject or the object of inquiry of that research. So, an objective account in this sense is something which is impartial, one which could ideally be accepted by any subject, but it does not draw on any assumption, prejudices, or values of particular subjects. So, objectivity rests on the belief that facts and values should be kept apart. That okay, facts are different, your values are different, they should be separated. So focus of your research should be on what it is rather than what ought to be. You cannot be prescriptive in your research that so in generally sociology we avoid this term like ought to be, should, because you are being judgmental. You are trying to approach things from a certain value perspective. So that's the reason why we tend to just describe the way it is and leave things for the readers or the audiences to judge. So Weber believed that there is nothing scientific about choosing a research. Topics can be chosen with the values of the researcher. Just few moments ago I was talking to you about you know the a researcher choosing the topic of domestic violence because he or she has always seen her mother being abused because of domestic violence. So here, when I say that, have you been objective? Definitely not, because I believe that domestic violence is a serious issue in this society. Right from my childhood has been affected because of it. I have seen women not being able to live a full-fledged life because of it. So I chose this kind of a research because it, you know the kind of values that I have, it prompted that kind of a sense in me. So here, can I choose my topic of research objectively without being influenced by my personal experience or without being affected by what are the things I believe in? That's what Weber says, that it is not possible. At least whenever you are talking about social sciences, it is very difficult to maintain the kind of neutrality that we expect whenever we are talking about objectivity, because the very choice of research has been prompted by your own life experience or your inclination towards certain things, which is again so very personal, and I can use the term so very subjective. So basically what he is trying to say is that topic can be chosen with the values of the researcher, But once the topic is chosen, the research process takes over. You have to, take up an objective procedure. Here, whenever I'm choosing my sample size, or I'm, using my sample uh, group, I don't use my personal subjectivity to guide me. I tend to remain neutral to the process and procedure of research. Weber opined that in case of public policy, selection of a goal was politically or economically motivated. But it doesn't mean that social science is irrelevant to public policy. Whenever, we talk about research, the state normally takes the call as to which subject needs to be looked into during this period of time. So there are so many motivations. There are political, economic motivation, but it doesn't mean that, for gathering pure knowledge, certain kind of research has completely been outdated. No, neither does it mean that social science has become completely irrelevant to public policy. So that's how things are. And there is another term that is associated with objectivity, that is the concept of value neutrality. So, what is this value neutrality? Uh, Normally, you might have seen, you might have heard, objectivity and value neutrality, they come hand in hand. It's very difficult to separate value neutrality from objectivity. And we believe that research methodology is all about maintaining objectivity and value neutrality, but that's a wrong way of doing so. There are different ways of doing research, and we can say that value neutrality is a special case of objectivity. It's a special case of objectivity. You will see that it's not seen in every case. Mm. Maybe we can take a 10 minutes break, and I'll come back with your idea of value neutrality to proceed further. you can have the standpoint depending on your own social reality, and that social reality is again your position. So qualitative researchers engage definitely in intersubjectivity, and this term in intersubjectivity, I guess you are aware of, is the Weberian concept of intersubjectivity, where you are trying to understand somebody else's subjectivity your with your own subjectivity. I am trying to see where somebody stands, how one is doing, how one is feeling, and I am using my own subjective experiences to understand your own subjective positions. Okay, the person looks like this today. This has happened in the morning. So perhaps when I was undergoing that kind of a phase, I was also feeling terrible. So you can only relate to those things that you have experienced as a human being and as a member of the society. So that's the reason why they say that qualitative researcher engages in intersubjectivity, because unless you engage with that kind of an intersubjectivity, you will never be in a position to, what do you say, accept uh, the views from the actor's point of view. So, repeatedly, I have been telling you that the basic difference between a positivist and an anti positivist or a constructivist position is that of where you stand, from whose point of view you are seeing things and you are reporting them. Is it the position of a distant observer who is outside the setting, who is just observing? I'm just nonchalant, I'm just not involved, I just observe everything, I'm not a part of that thing. Myself is, I have my own idea of self, and that self is not part of the community that I'm talking to. I can see the differences between me as a researcher, as the knower, and somebody who is the known, and we stand distances apart. So, is it that kind of a position? If it is, then that's a positivist position, and mostly I take up quantitative studies when I have to deal with these kind of positions. But when I'm talking about this very idea of understanding a group's perception of social reality, I'm really not bothered about how I or my own community feel about that particular thing. I'm really not bothered. I tend to engage in certain kind of intersubjectivity which takes into consideration the actor's point of view. So I am trying to see things from the point of view of an actor who is a part of that community, and I always use my own sensitivity. I'm empathetic to them. I use my own sensitivity to understand their position. I tend to relate it to my own experiences. So that is how things go about whenever I'm talking about qualitative research. So qualitative research, it investigates those dimensions of life which are not suitable for quantitative research or objective analysis, like attitude, intentions, experiences, and perceptions of people. Because as I was discussing with you yesterday, since we have borrowed most of the methodological perspectives, the methods, and the tools from natural sciences, we were, in some way or the other, we were trying to keep keep ourselves away from those ideas which cannot be dealt in a mechanical way, in an objective manner, where you have to treat your subject of study as an object. So we abstain from uh, items, entities like experience, human experience, human intention, perception, attitudes, because we had this fear that people might call it a scientific. So we were dealing with all those quantitative things, which could be done mechanically, for which I do not take the help of my subjective entity to be engaged with. So you know that's how this anti-positivist position started gaining importance after the 20th century. you know Entire throughout 19th century and the early part of 20th century, we have been talking about the positivist position, because we believed that that was the only way of doing research, and that is the only way you can claim to be scientific. So this position came with an understanding that, come on, you're dealing with human beings. You are not dealing with inanimate objects like the natural scientist. And isn't it a very reductionist approach, or it's a way of demeaning human beings when you are treating them like objects? So when you do not take the essence of human experience into consideration, you do not take the very idea of phenomenological understanding into consideration, that is based on human experience as to how I am feeling. You are not taking into consideration the very idea of human feelings. Then what kind of studies are you trying to conduct? Definitely this kind of a study is it will not reap the kind of results, because you are just trying to imitate uh, the natural scientist. So you have to create a niche area for yourself, where you can carve out your own space, your own methodology for doing research. And that's how we started dealing with the very idea of Weberian perspective. Just 1 minute. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that we started taking up this Weberian perspective seriously, that came as an opposition to this positivist principle, where they said that no, you can be equally objective. It doesn't mean that if you are undermining human experience or feeling, that will make you, you say, more scientific. So basically you are trying to take into use and gain more a deeper understanding of human behavior on the basis of observation and interpretation, to find out how people think, how people feel, because this has been something that we have been avoiding for the last 100 or 200 years in the name of positivist research. So qualitative methods, they started gaining importance when we started thinking that as social scientists and especially as sociologists, we need a special kind of a methodology. And the kind of methodology that you are dealing with is even what do you say, more challenging than that of the natural scientist, because of the issues we have already discussed. The first being the idea of keeping common sense at bay, because there is a very natural tendency among social scientists to fall into the trap of common sense, that anything which is accepted by the masses, you tend to take it to be true. So, challenging common sense, that is one aspect. Secondly, the idea of sociological imagination, where you are trying to think away from the routinized way of seeing things. You see things differently as a sociologist. That's how you do. So definitely there is one more challenge associated to it. And secondly, when I was talking about sociological imagination, there was another thing that I was telling, that you're juxtaposing history with biography, and at the same time you are not just seeing your personal issues in a very narrow sense. You are in fact, trying to detach yourself and see yourself as one of the players in the society who has been affected, like the other millions, with the same social structures or the same problems of inequality that others are facing. So basically you see yourselves as a subject of those social structures. That is how you see things as a sociologist. And fourthly, the idea of social reflexivity, self reflexivity, because that's one of the major challenges that you as a sociologist and a social scientist face. And this kind of a challenge will not be faced by, say, a natural scientist. So basically we have borrowed and sometimes devised our own methods. Take for example ethnography, grounded theory, discourse analysis, interpretive phenomenological analysis. These are some of the qualitative methods. When talk about quantitative methods, we talk about survey, we talk about experiments, how I'll be talking about the controlled and the group experiment and experimental groups, maybe in the next class, once we have little bit more clarity on the perspectives and the major designs that are associated with quantitative and qualitative research. So when I talk about qualitative research, it is basically a strategy for systematic collection, organization, and interpretation of data. So qualitative research and quantitative research, they both take the help of data, but it is a way of looking at data. A data can be qualitative in nature or it can be quantitative in nature. I'll give you an example. If I say, what is your age? You'd say that, okay, my age is 26 or 27. And when I say that, oh my God, you don't look your age, you just look like a 17-year-old guy. There is a basic difference. In the first statement you are coming up with a quantitative data, you are giving a number. And the second is when make this statement that you don't look your age, that is a qualitative nature of the data. I may not be giving you the exact estimate of the number or the of your age, but I am trying to talk about a qualitative nature of the data, that okay, you don't look your age, it is something not beyond 17. So this is how you handle data and how you do it. As I told you, you are using data from a quantitative point of view or a qualitative point of view. That matters. So you are describing. When I say that, okay, I'm describing something, you can have that description quantitatively as well as qualitatively. So when you have a table, when you have a enumeration of data in a tabular form, you have that the list of quantitative data. You are trying to give a say, I would say that, okay, tell me something about the demographic profile of a particular society. So maybe you have the age distribution, the sex distribution, you have the gender distribution, or the literacy rate. That is a quantitative enumeration of the data. Now I will tell you that, okay, tell me something about the population of that locality or that city. Maybe you can talk about some of the traits, some of the characteristics of that population. So you do it qualitatively. So basically what I'm trying to say is that we deal with two basic forms of research which have different world views, which calls for different positions, philosophical positions, and they bring along with them certain new strategies of inquiry, different methods of inquiry, and different tools. So they all go hand in hand. So depending on the research problem, you tend to choose your philosophical viewpoint, your worldview, as to, the very other day I was talking about that, when I'm talking about a particular study on migration, do I need to use a quantitative framework or a qualitative framework? So it depends what is the nature of the problem that you are trying to study, and accordingly you will choose the worldview. As I told you that if you are trying to understand you know the basic say the trend of migration, or the very idea of seasonal migration, you are just trying to see that during what season migration rates goes up, or during what season it goes down, you will pick up a worldview that is deposited in the positivist framework, and accordingly you will choose your method. That, okay, I need to do it quantitatively. I need to talk about the masses and give a generalized form of data. So that's how I will be choosing survey as a method. I will choose questionnaire as a tool. So they all go hand in hand. You pick up the worldview, and the methodology and the tools will follow accordingly. But when I'm trying to say, I'm trying to enumerate human experiences, the experience of being migrant, the experience of leaving behind and in your home, and making a strange place your home and trying to survive there, I am again choosing my worldview. I'm choosing the constructivist position, an anti-positivist position, where I would say that, okay, if I'm just talking about a group which is not, dispersed everywhere, it is just localized in a particular society. Maybe I can pick up an ethnography, or I can use interview schedule as a tool. The method has to be ethnography, or the method has to be interview. So schedule or interview guide could be one of the tools, so they fall in place. So it is basically the nature of the research problem that calls for the worldview, the strategies of inquiry, the methods, and the tools. So when you're talking about qualitative research, it is basically a strategy for systematic collection, organization, and interpretation of data. In both ways you are interpreting, but it again depends how you collect the data, what strategies you have applied, how you have organized the data. That creates all the differences between qualitative and quantitative data. So a definition given by Dangin and Lincoln says that it is a methodology which has multi-method in focus, involving an interpretive naturalistic approach to its subject matter. So just try to have a look at this diagram. When I'm talking about qualitative methods or a qualitative research, I am talking about understanding. The most important thing here is to understand the community or the society I'm trying to study. When it comes to quantitative things, I'm trying to generalize things. That, okay, can I have some universal laws if it is applicable to my country? Could it be applied on the American society or the European society? I'm trying to generalize it, isn't it? But generalization might not be the sole priority of qualitative research. Here, they are just trying to understand the phenomena, and it could be a very small society, it could be a very localized phenomena. But here, I am just out here to, register and document the way people perceive something. So, understanding and interpretation is one of the major goals of quantitative research, qualitative research. Any questions? Any doubts? Any clarifications? Any questions? Yeah. Yes. You can write down in the chat box if you want. Do you? No? Okay, we can call it an end. So, we will move on to another block in the next class, that is on Monday. Thank you. Thank you all.